I'm delighted now to be joined by Matthew Lesh, the Director of Public Policy and Communication at the Institute of Economic Affairs, one of the country's leading and most important think tanks. Thank you so much for coming in. It seems to me that migration has become a drug for the British economy, that we've become dependent on it, and we are failing either to move up the productivity scale so that we don't need the immigration, or to train our own people to do the jobs.
Well, Jacob, you could just as easily say that the UK is such a fantastic and welcoming place that it attracts so many immigrants, and that the reason why immigration is so high at the moment is because of also the generosity of the British people in terms of welcoming Hong Kongers, welcoming Ukrainians, as well as, I suppose, the gaps and skills that need to be filled. The single biggest workers who come by immigration are probably almost certainly in the health and care sector, filling skills gaps that exist.
But aren't we therefore failing to pay people in social care enough, and that therefore people in the UK don't want to do it? It's not that people won't do the jobs, it's they're not paid well enough against benefits for it to be economically sensible, and that we're not looking, as the Japanese are, at ways of making the social care sector more productive, so using AI and using remote monitoring techniques that in Japan have been very successful.
Look, and there are fundamental issues in the productivity of the NHS and the care sector and right across the economy, we've seen that, but I don't think it makes sense to blame immigrants for that. There are also shortages. You've got to remember there are over 1 million job vacancies in the UK. There are not 1 million people who are capable of fulfilling those roles, and we end up hurting ourselves and pushing up inflation and pushing up costs if we don't address.
But that's a slightly different argument, isn't it? That if you're talking about the highly skilled jobs, comfortably above the income threshold, that's one set of people. If you're talking about care workers, the training to be a care worker is much less than it is, for example, to be a dentist, where we have a genuine shortage.
Well, you've got to ask yourself, so do you want people doing those jobs? How many are going to be going there? Does having care workers coming from abroad, people who are willing to do those jobs, allow other people in the economy to then move up into higher skilled, higher paid jobs? So it's not necessarily the case that you have a kind of lump labour and we're worse off, and it's an immigrant taking from a local. We can have more jobs, of course.
But if that were true, wouldn't our productivity be increasing if people were going from low-skilled jobs to higher-skilled jobs? And that the productivity problem in the UK, since 1997, the public sector has seen productivity decline, is one that shows that just taking cheap immigrant labour is not solving our productivity problem, or indeed our labour market problem.
Well, indeed, I agree with you about the productivity problem. I think this is the biggest problem we face as a society, but I don't think that's caused by immigrants. I think immigrants, if anything, make big productivity contributions to the economy. And you can say that at the low skill as well as the high skill level, and more so at the high skill level where there's a stronger case.
But is that right? The reason I push back on this is because if you had to get the existing labour force to do it, you would have to pay them more, because supply and demand would mean wages would go up, which gives businesses the incentive to invest in mechanisation or to move out of low productivity businesses. So there's a lot of migrant labour to come and pick soft fruit. Actually, this country should not be in the soft fruit growing business if we can't do it economically. The comparative advantage means that we should be importing it.
Well, perhaps, I mean, it's hard to, from up a high judge whether or not the UK economy should be structured in A way or B way. I think I'd make a broader point here about the kind of impact of immigration, which is to say it's kind of presumptive to think that they're lowering the alternative would be investments in these areas. Then there's not other much bigger barriers in the way here. If you want to fix the productivity crisis, the best thing you could do is to fix the planning system. I think that's going to do much better than trying to cut off immigration. When if you trying to cut down immigration quite significantly, you could end up with far more issues and far more inflation. And I think we saw this from Boris, didn't we, in late last year, where he said, "Oh, isn't this great? We've seen wages tick up. We've now got everything I wanted: a high productivity, high skill economy." No, in reality, that was just inflation. I think the reality of what you're going to get if you cut off immigrants is just more inflation in the short term, which may be a cost you're willing to pay. There's no absolute right or wrong answer about the number of immigrants in this respect, but there are trade-offs that need to be considered.
But what we're currently getting, so the figures everyone was very pleased with last week, showing that the UK economy had grown faster than Germany and France and so on since 2010. But when you looked at GDP per capita, we hadn't. And that therefore what we've been doing is getting low GDP per capita growth because of mass migration, which means the standard of living in this country, for the average Briton, is not rising as fast as it is in other countries.
Well, I would say that the issue with productivity growth is a whole bunch of other issues that I think you and I would agree on. Issues like we're regulating businesses out of existence with so many burdens that we don't allow people to live potentially nearby to where they're most productive.
I wrote a pamphlet for the IEA a few years ago on the planning problem, and it's got worse rather than better. And I absolutely agree with you. That is a missed opportunity. It's why I come back to immigration being the sort of national drug, because instead of tackling the other problems that increase productivity and help the economy grow, we say, let's just bring in a few more 100,000 people from abroad. And it doesn't solve the underlying problems.
But I think in the end, it's not the underlying problem. You know, immigrants, if you dive into the studies on this, time and time again, the studies do not suggest that immigrants are lowering the productivity. If anything, it's the opposite, and they're making a net contribution. You know, the average EU immigrant, for example, the studies suggested was providing 1,000 net gain to the British taxpayer, to the public sector in the UK. Now, you can, as the UK has done, you know, rightfully so, chosen not just to be biased in favour of EU immigrants and to accept immigrants from all over the world, but I think you would simply find on net immigrants are making a contribution to the UK economy, and that the productivity issues are very little to do with immigration and a lot to do with other issues.